And a very good morning, good night, good evening, good afternoon to all our listeners and viewers here to this special program, Roundtable number 2. We had Roundtable number 1 on Tuesday as we reflect on the late Honorable Chief Minister of Anguilla, Hubert Benjamin Hughes, the man and his politics. Today, of course, we are focusing on regional and international figures who will be sharing their memories of the late former Chief Minister. We have with us from Sabre, the former Sabre politician, civil servant, a writer, just about everything, Will Johnson. He'll be joining us. And we also have with us on the roundtable today, Peter Wickham, a political scientist out of Barbados, Dorothea Hodge, the head of the UK Anguilla office, Dr. Peter Clegg from the University of the West of London, West of England, I should say, and very, very importantly, surprise for the people of Anguilla, we have the former governor of Anguilla, Christina Scott, who has decided to stay up very late, 12 hours ahead, from Beijing, China, joining us as well. Dr. Denzel Douglas out of St. Kitts will be in with us a little later. So I want to say a warm welcome to each and everyone, and welcome to this roundtable number 2 as we reflect on the man and his politics, the late Honorable Chief Minister of Anguilla, Benjamin Hughes. So what we'll do firstly, let's go to Sabre, and we say a very warm welcome to Will Johnson. And Will, perhaps you can just share with us your memories of the late Chief Minister. Will Johnson.
Thank you very much. First of all, my condolences to the family of the Honorable Minister Hughes and to the people of Anguilla. I know him as a strong fighter in the political world. He first came to my attention when the Honorable Ronald Webster, who was a very great personal friend of mine, decided to position himself in a district where Mr. Hughes was from. And I would have bet my house that Mr. Webster would have won that election. But on Anguilla, you have district voting, whereas on Sabre and the Dutch Islands, you get votes from everywhere. And so the party is elected, and then depending on your position in the party, you get elected. Well, anyway, sometime back when Stacia was put under heavy manners by the Dutch, they sent somebody here by me to ask what I thought about how the results would be. So I told him, listen, my friend, you all don't know how West Indian politics works. First of all, you depends on how big a family you got, where which district you're living in, if you can put up a big enough mouth or what. And I told him, you send the government of Stacia home, but the Honorable Clyde Van Putten has 22 brothers and sisters, and they're all grown adults with wives and husbands and big children that can vote. So you're not going to get him out. And so said, so done. When he did hold the elections, Clyde Van Putten won again. Well, that is how Mr. Hughes in his district, he had a lot of family and friends and so. And Mr. Webster was up by the East End. And although he had done so much for Anguilla, the world expected that he could position himself anywhere and win, but it didn't work out that way. Personally, I met Mr. Hughes in Berlin. He was there. I can't remember if he was Minister of Tourism at the time, but I was there with the Dutch delegation checking out that big exhibition they have from the world. In February every year they have it to attract tourists and so on. And so the Anguilla booth was not far from where we had a booth for the Three Windward Islands, and I would walk over there and talk with him. We had lunch together and so on. And from then I knew him very much. I've had a privilege of knowing every chief minister of Anguilla from the very beginning, and everyone I would consider a personal friend, and so it came, death always comes as a shock, no matter how old you are. So when I heard it on the news that he had passed, all kinds of memories went past me, how I knew him, and so he was a man that didn't have any bone in his tongue. I'm from the same school that I became well known because I got in trouble and even, prosecuted a few times because I would say things the way I saw them. And I think that Mr. Hughes was from the same school that I went to. But, he has left a mark on Anguilla politics for sure. And I am sure that he will be fondly remembered by his people and people for the region. So once again, let me pass on the condolences to his family and the people of Anguilla. And even though I am no longer speaking on behalf of SABR, I still feel that SABR people will be happy to hear that I am passing on my condolences on their behalf as well.
Okay, Will, we want to thank you so very much for joining us this morning and sharing your thoughts on your memories of the former Chief Minister. Okay, Will, it seems as though we've lost Will.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Will. Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome. You're welcome. My pleasure.
So that was the Honorable Will Johnson out of SABR, who knew Mr. Hughes very well. Will Johnson served exactly 50 years in various capacities as civil servant and as politician in SABR in the Dutch Caribbean territories, the Dutch Windward Islands. All right, we can go across and say a very warm welcome to the former governor of Anguilla, Christina Scott, who served in Anguilla from 2013 to 2017. She's now deputy head of the mission at the British Embassy in Beijing, China. She's been in that position since September 2018. Christina, a very warm welcome to you. I know it's pretty late at night there in China. We're happy that you've stayed up to be with us here this morning. Over.
I'm happy I've stayed up as well, and it's good to see you, Keith. But it's a shame that it's in such sad circumstances as we join together to commemorate the life of a really extraordinary politician. So thank you very much for inviting me onto your show.
Certainly, Christina, any memories of your time spent here in Anguilla and coming into contact with the late honorable former leader, Hubert Benjamin Hughes?
Oh my goodness, so many memories, Keith. I can't tell you. I sat down this afternoon and tried to jot some down. I mean, it was, I arrived here in Anguilla in 2013, and, I met a guy in his 80th year who was so full of life and energy and beans and so full of sort of drive to get things done. And it was really, a fantastic person to work alongside for a couple of years. His welcome to me was fantastic. Right from the first go, he was incredibly helpful and warm and welcoming, and took great care to help me understand Anguilla and get me in touch with people. And I really appreciated that. And then we worked together for 2 years across a whole range of really difficult issues on the banks, on a whole range of security issues. We didn't always see eye to eye, but what was good about the relationship I think we had is that even when we had our disagreements, there was always deep respect on both sides. And we always had a laugh at the end of it and always gave each other a hug at the end and made up and recognized our differences. And sometimes we had to take pretty difficult decisions together. But really, we worked pretty well, I think, together. And it was a real privilege to work with him.
What about the man that stood out for you? What would linger in your memory? Something about...
I think it was his... Well, his dedication to Anguilla. It was a life of service, wasn't it? 5 decades, 6 decades. The experts on the call will tell us. But and I only worked with him for his last 2 years as chief minister. But really what stood out for me was his sheer energy and determination and his sharp wit. I mean, he could be very funny. I mean, he sometimes, I used to kind of catch him what I thought was dozing in exco meetings, and I would say quietly, "Chief Minister, are you asleep?" And he'd quick as a shot say, "No, I don't need my eyes to listen to you, Governor." And I never managed to catch him out. I mean, it was always good, and he would, Anguilla must be missing sitting here, seeing him sitting on his balcony as people drive past, and he would spot me as I was driving past, and then give me a call afterwards and check where I was going just to keep an eye on me. And I bet he was doing that with everybody on the island. I mean, he was just so on it in his 80th year. I can only imagine what he must have been like in his 60th and his 70th. I mean, he was really a force to be reckoned with, and a great character.
But Hughes was never one to shy away. He was very forthright and upfront. In terms of his decision-making process in Executive Council, how did you find him in terms of making those tough, difficult decisions? You sitting as chair in Executive Council.
Well, I mean, good. I mean, he used the advice of his officials. He was very close to his senior officials, it seemed to me, and on the whole listened carefully to their advice. He spoke widely to political colleagues across the region as well, and his relationships with some key individuals, including the governor of the central bank, was really helped us at various points. When we had bigger difficulties, he would come and see me at my house, or he would call me up, and I'd have to go down to his offices, and we'd have a pretty frank conversation. But it was always in a constructive tone. And I think, he kind of he relied on his ministers as well. So it was, he worked collaboratively, didn't take decisions without discussing them through with other people first, I think. I mean, others would be better placed to judge than me, because sometimes I think, he would have taken his decision by the time he came to talk to me. But I always got the sense that decision was informed by talking to a lot of people. And he had his ear close to the ground, it seemed to me. He always was talking to people on the street, but also talking to the senior officials and to other politicians. And he really had the ear of so many people on the island, and I think probably consulted pretty widely.
Was there any time you had to say, well, Chief, no, we definitely can't do this one. We can't go ahead with this one. It just doesn't add up. Was there many times or any time that you had to just stand up and say, Chief, this one is not going to play. We don't need to waste our time.
Well, some of those, Keith, were public, and they were we talked about them at the time. I mean, delays, for example, on signing off the budget when we were looking for certain guarantees. The British government was looking for certain commitments from Anguilla to reform certain aspects of the system. And he was very angry with me for a while for holding up signing off of the budget. So that was one that was public, and we talked, I think, probably on your show at the time about the decisions behind that. I mean, there were others, of course, but we kept them behind closed doors. And I think, what worked well, I hope others would agree, is that we were able to have those differences and slug them out, but it never became personal, and it never really spilt out into the press and into the public. And I think that meant that we had a better working relationship as a result.
Mr. Hughes was always very pro-independence. He took an anti-colonial stance.
He did.
Share at any time these particular issues with you in a very direct way?
Not in a very direct way, no, Keith. I mean, he knew the position of the British government, which was then and continues to be now, that when it's the decision of the Anguillian people, as expressed democratically by a winning party, that they wish to move towards independence, then that will be a process that is supported. And he never actually came to me and had that formal conversation with me whilst I was there. We would sometimes joke about it, but no, never really a serious application to take that process forward.
So as we go along, former governor, again, share with us your lasting memory, having worked alongside the former Chief Minister, Hubert Hughes.
Well, as I say, Keith, it's a really memory of somebody who worked incredibly hard for Anguilla, and always, I think, took decisions that they thought were going to be in the best interests of Anguilla. that was really a man of the people. It seemed to me he knew everybody in Anguilla. He knew the backstories to all the backstories. When you got him talking about that, you could learn a great deal if you listened carefully. He had a sharp wit, and he was very much a family man. He was so proud of his children, really just a great guy to work with. I have funny memories, him walking around London in the cold. Dorothy will remember joint ministerial councils refusing to take his woolly scarf off photographs with UK ministers, complaining about the cold, but then going straight in with a killer points to get more money for Anguilla or to negotiate hard on an issue with UK ministers. I mean, he really, he did a good job for Anguilla, I think, in the circumstances. And, I'm sure that I hope really that amidst all the sorrow, and tomorrow will be, I know, a very difficult day for many people, but I hope that amidst that sorrow, there can be a celebration of a life that really was well lived and very full, and which I think contributed a lot to Anguilla.
It would be remiss of me if I didn't allow you, even in this very solemn occasion, allow you to pass some greetings. I know you have many friends here in Anguilla. You're very fond of Anguilla. You loved Anguilla. So I would just afford you that opportunity.
Well, Keith, look, my thoughts today are with Hubert's family and with all of his friends and everyone who will be mourning and having a solemn day tomorrow. And my thoughts will be with you as I go about my business here during the course of the day. So thank you very much for having me on your show today. And if you don't mind, I'll hang around a little bit because I'm really keen to hear the reflections of the others on the call.
Certainly. Christina Scott, former governor of Anguilla 2013 to 2017, now the deputy head of mission at the British Embassy in Beijing, China. Thank you so very much. Here is someone now who knew and was very close to the late Honorable former Chief Minister Hubert Hughes. Dorothea Hodge, she heads the UK office for Anguilla. So Dorothea, I want to say good afternoon to you there at this time in the UK, and certainly we want to welcome you.
Good afternoon, Keith, and can I first offer my condolences to the Hughes family and to the friends of Mr. Hughes and to the people of Anguilla. I think at this time we all mourn a great, incredible, extraordinary leader, and as the former governor has just said, a life truly, truly, truly well lived. And I think from my perspective, it was an honor to serve with Mr. Hughes. And I will miss him very dearly. His wisdom, his insight, his passion, his knowledge, his commitment to put the people of Anguilla first before anything else in a life which was really, really dedicated to his country. So it's a real honor to be here, but my deepest condolences are today with his family as they miss that genius, that tower, that leader in the form of, as I used to call him, the Chief Minister.
And I know you're very close to the late Hubert Hughes. What for you stood out when you were in his circle, when you worked alongside him while he was in office?
Well, Keith, in this time of commemoration, I think from my perspective, he was an extraordinary leader at home and abroad. So at home, I used to call him, he was a veranda politician. Anybody and anyone could come and see him on his veranda. And if he could pick up his phone, call somebody and fix your problem, he would fix it. And if it meant he had to fix it through government, he would fix it. And I think many of us know, he fixed a lot of people's problems personally out of his own pocket as well. So at home, he was a veranda politician who was committed every day. He woke every day in service to his people, whether he was in government or out of government. Service was his watchword. And then abroad, and I had the privilege of seeing him both home and abroad, but serving him really abroad, we were very, very clear of his top line objectives. It was the people of Anguilla first, the country of Anguilla first. And that trumped everything else. He was incredibly pragmatic. And as the former governor has said, would negotiate incredibly toughly with the UK on behalf of his beloved Anguilla and on behalf of the people of Anguilla. But he was also incredibly pragmatic to work through a solution that benefited both parties, so everybody could walk out of that door with their heads held high. And that is an unusual trait in a politician. He would take sides, but he would tell you he would take sides. And he would tell you, this will be my position. But he never, ever, ever stopped from waking every morning. And he was often the first up and the first to call me. And those who work alongside us will tell you that we start early, 7 a.m., and we finish late, 11 p.m. That's a normal day at a JMC in London, or if we're traveling abroad, we work because that's the opportunity for the leaders to meet, to strike deals, and to get what is needed for the people. And Mr. Hughes was the first to start and the last to finish. So an extraordinary leader, both at home and abroad, extraordinary.
How did you manage, alongside Josephine Gomes-Connor, his personal legal advisor, to keep him on track? There were times he could waver, he could go off target. How you guys managed to just keep him to the script? And I know he was very much unscripted. He hated scripts.
So that's a very interesting question. I should say that he kept us on target. He was very, very clear with us about, especially myself, about his objectives. And it meant that I was always very clear about where the red lines were in any negotiations, whether that was with the EU, whether that was with international institutions like the OECD, or whether that was with the UK government. And he was a swift absorber of knowledge and information. And I think one of the things that always struck us as we worked with him was his knowledge and insight in terms of the political history of the world that shaped the decision-making of today. Because he was one of those rare politicians that truly had an interest in the political economy of the world. So he would quote history, knowledge and insight, which meant he came to the table with a full context. Now, I think one of the things that he perhaps garnered from the time that we worked together was he was always a very fiery politician. And he was very close to my father. And I remember my father used to say, Mr. Hughes, you have to have more diplomacy. And he was a fiery politician. And I think one of the things that we garnered together was I had spent time as a special advisor in the UK government. So I thoroughly understood the UK government. And I've also understood Mr. Hughes's position. And over time, we worked out how we could get the deal we wanted, combining everybody's, the legal knowledge, the political knowledge. So once we got into our stream collectively as a team, whoa, Mr. Hughes was leading from the front. He always led from the front. He led from the front.
Dorothy, we'll get back to you. This time I would like to bring in Peter Wickham, political consultant and the director of the leading Caribbean political research company, Caribbean Development Research Services, CADRIS. Peter previously lectured in political science and research methods at the UWI Cavell campus. So Peter, a very warm welcome to you.
Hi, morning, and thank you for the invitation, Keith. I'm happy to be part of this panel. At the outset, let me say that I am somewhat peculiar in this group in that I am the only person who has never met the individual. I know of Chief Minister Hughes from his legacy, and certainly in my work around the region, and a number of times his name has come up. I've only ever done research in Anguilla once, and that's very recently. So he would not have been part of it. So I am somewhat at a disadvantage in the group in that I don't have any personal reflections to share. But what I will do is I will give up my understanding of his impact regionally, which is important. And I'm certainly happy to be part of this conversation. And let me start by expressing condolences to his family on the passing of this distinguished gentleman.
And that is precisely why I invited you, Peter, because of your knowledge, your depth and breadth of regional politics. So let me throw it to you before I throw it to Dr. Clegg, who will also speak to the wider political dynamics on a more regional level and how Mr. Hughes's type and brand of politics fitted into that mold. But Peter, on a Caribbean level, Mr. Hughes was known to be a regionalist, a Caribbean integrationist, anti-colonial in his stance, very much pro-independence. And he was also very, very much in tune with the former leaders in Africa, the Nelson Mandelas, Jomo Kenyatta. He came from that mold. But from your studies, from what you've gleaned of Mr. Hughes and his brand of politics, we'd just like to hear your thoughts on this, Peter Wickham.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting where you started, and certainly Chief Minister Hughes is not very different to several of the other legacies that we have had across the legacy leaders that we've had across the Caribbean. People like Manley's and Eric Williams, Howard Barra, people of that nature. You know, the interesting thing about him, though, is that he is one of those politicians, and there are a lot of them in the region, especially among the smaller islands, even though all of us are technically small, where they're constrained by the size of the island, the size of the population, and the extent to which that allows them to impact fully. So we have these big personalities, and he's one of them, and we have to squeeze them into small spaces where they operate at a level which is considerably below that which they should probably be operating at. And I think that Chief Minister Hughes was one such person. His understanding of the colonial struggle and the fact that he does have a familiarity with several African leaders who would have been part of that struggle. His generation of politicians studied the African struggle and to some extent the Indian struggle. And they try as far as possible to replicate it in the other islands. Anguilla is peculiar in that Anguilla did not walk the road of independence with, say, Kitts and Nevis for reasons that are well known to you, and we don't have to go into those here. But it creates a situation in which Anguilla then continues as an associated state of the United Kingdom, even to this day. And you have to essentially craft an anti-colonial struggle within that context. So Williams and Burnham and all of the others said, okay, we're going to deal with this anti-colonial thing by pushing forward with independence. In the case of Chief Minister Hughes, even though he spoke of independence and he understood the anti-colonial struggle, I think it was clear in terms of what I hear him saying that the process of decolonization for Anguilla has to come at a point in time when it is allowed to be ready for that level of decolonization. So it was not like Jamaica that could just say, look, let's get it and go forward. In his case, I'm hearing from him that we understand that there are certain developmental prerequisites that have to be established, like an international airport, you know, that would allow us to be able to be part of the global community in a sense on all fours. And certainly when I listened to Christina talking, you know, she was talking about the budgetary issues and whatnot. And I hear in his speeches a lot of concern that the British, the colonial powers have to understand that in order to essentially set Anguilla free in an independent way, there's certain things that have to be put in place in terms of their commitments to development. And I heard it in relation to Irma and the development that needed to come forth at that level. And it's an interesting conversation, as I said. It is part of, I would say, almost like a micro island feature of this anti-colonial struggle, where it can be approached in the way that Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago and so on approached it, or Barbados even. It has to be approached in a way that's special and peculiar. And that was significant. The other thing that I thought was interesting is his outreach to CARICOM and the OECS. And, you know, Anguilla is an associated state in both regards. And that's interesting. So he also spoke about the relationship with the other associated states, the Dutch and the French. And in his speeches, you always hear reference to the Dutch and the French islands in a way that he wants to have a partnership of sorts to places like St. Martin, who are in a similar associated status. And he clearly understood that Anguilla was part of a community, a Caribbean community, the OECS community, and a European community, and shared a lot in common with these associated states. And that was something he felt he could leverage to its greater benefit. The other point that I made here in relation to him was the reference to population growth and development. And that's something that's absolutely important. And I think that in many instances, politicians from smaller islands often cherish the smallness, and there's an aversion to population growth. And I did not hear that in him. And I think that that's important and something that we need to flag, because he understood that there was a link between economic development and population growth. And he embraced it. And I think that's also a remarkable thing, because sadly, too many politicians that come from countries the size of Anguilla don't cherish the size and the lack of a population growth too much. And I think that he made that link between, if we're going to move on, we have to find ways of growing the population, developing it in that way.
Peter, we'll certainly get back to you. Certainly some very interesting comments. We've also had a number of condolence messages coming from across the CARICOM region, and I would just like to share one from the Honorable Roosevelt Skerrit, the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Dominique and the Chairman of the OECS Authority. And in his message of condolence, Mr. Skerrit said, "Comrade Hughes was a true Caribbean champion, very passionate about our distinctive civilization. It was a privilege to have served with him. My condolences to the people and government of Anguilla. May his soul rest in peace." I would at this time like to introduce to you Professor Peter Clegg from the University of the West of England in Bristol. As I said, Peter would be looking at taking a slightly wider swath at the Caribbean leadership and how, in his opinion, he thought Hubert Hughes would have fitted into that. I should let you know that Dr. Clegg, his expertise is in the area of international political economy for the Commonwealth Caribbean. He's focused on governance and development issues in the non-independent territories. And in fact, his most recent publication, COVID-19 and the British OTs, a comparative view. And then he also has been associated with another publication, Parties, Elections, and Political Maturation in the UK Overseas Territories, a contribution to a handbook of governance in small states. So Peter, Dr. Clegg, we just want to hear your view, looking at the leadership that would have been provided by the late Hubert Hughes and Caribbean leadership on a whole. We've had the passing of Michael Manley, and Peter Wickham alluded to this. Michael Manley, Vissy Bird, Forbes Burnham, Tom Adams, John Compton, John Osborne, Patrick Manning, Eddie Seaga. And now we are sort of seeing a change in the landscape of political leadership, where we are seeing a new brand, a new style of leaders coming through in the Caribbean. So we'd just like to hear your view on all of this in light of the recent passing of the late Hubert Hughes. Dr. Clegg.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for the invitation. And just to, of course, share my condolences as well. I think my panel members have extremely, very effectively articulated the contribution that Mr. Hughes has had over many years, both in relation to Anguilla itself, but also the region and the wider world. So just a few observations. I think what Peter said was very sort of onto the point, really, in terms of Mr. Hughes was a part of probably a fading generation of very charismatic, larger-than-life politicians. And perhaps things have become a little bit duller now within the context of Caribbean politics, and also within the context of the overseas territories. Some of the great figures that have been in the territories, like Ralph O'Neill, for example. So I think Mr. Hughes certainly sets himself up and is aligned with those names over Caribbean political history. And the fact that he, came into Parliament in 1976, had such an influential, dominant role, serving as chief minister on 2 occasions for a decade, and also after a decade out of office coming back as well, which is a significant achievement and is quite rare in certainly the context of politics outside of the Caribbean. So I think that as Dot and Christina have said, that the focus on public service has been exemplary. The longevity is very exceptional, I think. The fact that he established new political movements, new political parties, and a very passionate and strong advocate for Anguilla, as we've seen and heard. And it's interesting, Christina, talking about perhaps sometimes the harsh rhetoric against the United Kingdom on occasion, but also the effectiveness that he was working with the governor and with ministers and others back in London. And I think this issue of independence and self-determination is an interesting one. And Peter again sort of alluded to the fact getting to the point where greater self-determination or independence might be an option in the future. And for Anguilla, it's still a really open question. And perhaps one issue for Anguilla and the role that Mr. Hughes played was, could more have been done possibly to make those preparations for maybe a more serious and in-depth discussion about the position of Anguilla within the Caribbean and its relationship to the United Kingdom. So the UK, as Christina alluded to, and Dot too, the UK position is very strong on this issue, and they have their clear red lines. And I think in the past, Mr. Hughes aspired to the Bermuda model of the Constitution, whereby Bermuda has much more devolved power, less of a role for the governor. And in some ways, I guess that's why from 1982 until very recently, the idea of constitutional reform was rather stuck. So Anguilla didn't follow the other territories within the Caribbean a decade or so ago to gain a new constitution and gain greater power. So on the one hand, you could argue that was a very strong and righteous view to hold on the part of Mr. Hughes, that he wanted a better deal with the UK government. But on the other hand, it perhaps did leave Anguilla a little bit behind the others in terms of its political and constitutional development. But as others have said, his strength of feeling regarding Anguilla was very strong. And maybe that's the overarching sense to take about the fact that the Constitution from 1982 didn't change too much at all. I guess more generally thinking about the political contribution, and again, this is about the changes, or in some ways the lack of changes within Anguilla. I know there are concerns and issues raised about the nature of the democratic system. So you mentioned my recent piece about how the political systems in Anguilla have evolved. And again, this is certainly not an issue for Mr. Hughes, but more generally regarding some of the issues that could have strengthened Anguillan democracy and perhaps put them on a stronger path towards greater self-determination, maybe even independence, around campaign financing, for example, around the nature of constituency size within Anguilla. So if one was dispassionate, and maybe this is not the best time to do it, but if it's a dispassionate overview and insight into the man, his policies, perhaps you could say in some of these areas where he had the opportunity to really make a difference and really to follow through in all respects in terms of what he stood for, some of those changes perhaps could have been made under his watch or with greater support from him. But in the scheme of things, I guess those are relatively sort of minor issues. And it's about commemorating and remembering someone who will always be remembered, will be aligned to some of the great leaders within the Caribbean. And I think that's his legacy that Anguilla is strong, is recognized, is a significant partner within the Caribbean. And as you suggested, the links to the Dutch and the French Caribbean, I mean, that's great foresight, really. That's always a challenge for the Caribbean to bring together the various countries and territories within the region, across culture, across language. And I think Mr. Hughes had that vision and foresight to focus on the importance of that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clegg. We'll get back to you. Dorothy, I see you've been chomping at the bit. You wanted to perhaps comment on something Peter, Dr. Clegg would have said there in terms of the contribution of the late Hubert Hughes. And as I said, you were right next to him.
Yes, and thank you. And it's so wonderful to hear outsiders' perspectives. So but thank you both Peters, both Peter Clegg and Peter, for your outsider's perspective. And it is a very, very accurate perspective of the person that was the man, the great leader that was Mr. Hughes. It took a certain type of leader in a post-colonial period to navigate their country successfully to an outcome that means today Anguilla is a relatively stable overseas territory. And despite the challenges, and I think Peter's outlined its small size and its small population, Mr. Hughes has been consistent in terms of that vision for a greater degree of independence. And he has been a stalwart on that, on the constitutional independence that the UK would, that Anguilla would want. And he's also been a stalwart on the need for economic independence. And he will have repeated many a time and spent a great deal of time noting that a country cannot grow unless it has the means of access. And we will have heard him repeat that. He repeated it incessantly in the UK, in fact, struck several deals with the UK in terms of getting towards an airport, a substantial airport for Anguilla in his time. So he was a unique individual in his ability to steer his country. He was uncorruptible. And I think that is a point that is incredibly important in this period of time where it was clear there was never an issue that you could pin on him in terms of his integrity as a politician, because he put his people first. And that was the only motivation for him taking his time in office. And because he put his people first and he put his island first, he did have some robust red lines about the economic independence, the journey towards economic independence that was required to enable Anguilla to prosper and its people to prosper. So he was, he was extraordinary in also his ability to work with that global network. And that also was something I saw very, very close, in very close quarters. When Anguilla went through its banking crisis and he was at the helm, he didn't fold his arms up and wait for an economist to arise out of the sky to support the country. He rolled his sleeves up and said, right, what do we do? Who do we talk to? Let's get going. And he tasked us all to work across the region to find a uniquely Caribbean solution to the challenges the island faced. But he also was able to work on these issues from an international perspective. And I think it's often the part that people don't really see on island. It is that commitment to, as Christina mentioned, traveling in inclement weather. It is that commitment to, he's a politician that I convinced that he was needed to go up to the Arctic Circle to negotiate on behalf of his country. And he spent 5 or 6 days leading from the front in his 80s in the Arctic Circle, striking deals with the European Union, striking deals with the government of Greenland, striking deals with other premiers on behalf of his territory, in circumstances I think most of us in our latter years would probably not entertain. And that, for me, demonstrates the real character of this extraordinary leader that we were privileged to have. You often don't know what you've lost until it's not there. And you sometimes don't know what you've gained because of someone. And I can categorically say, in the time that I had the privilege to serve under Mr. Hughes, Anguilla would not be the country it is today had Mr. Hughes not put his red lines down to protect the lives of the people of Anguilla and to protect that very, very, very fragile thing that is a country and its history and its heritage. And we would not be the place we are today with the freedoms Anguilla has today, were it not for the kind of politician that Mr. Hughes was. And he endured a great deal of respect from the other leaders. Where perhaps we might have thought of him as being rambunctious and controversial, in fact, the other leaders would often defer to him as the elder statesman in the team with the greatest wisdom, and where there may have been any level of disrespect, would back him to the hilt. And I have seen other leaders call meetings to a halt because of a position that Mr. Hughes has put on the table, and have backed him to the hilt against the UK. So he was an extraordinary leader for his people, an extraordinary leader in the region, an extraordinary visionary, and a person who lived a life of service and put the people first and his country first.
Yeah. Thank you, Dorothy. And this is where I'd like to bring back in Peter Wickham. Peter, the changing landscape of political leadership in the Caribbean, newer faces, including several women now coming to the fore, this seismic shift, if you like, from the style and the methodology used by the late Hubert Hughes. We would just like to hear your thoughts on this shift in the style and the brand of leadership that we are now seeing in our Caribbean region. And how does this play into the ones that we saw in persons like Hubert Hughes and John Osborne, from in that type of a mold?
Yeah, it's interesting that you raised that. I am always hesitant to critique leaders like Mr. Hughes and Osborne, but the reality is that the style of leadership is a relic of a slightly different era. Those guys grew up in the trade union movement, in the anti-colonial struggle, and you mentioned Nkrumah and so on, and it was a revolution. It was different. Leadership now has taken on a slightly more consensual and negotiatory tone, if you could call it that. Largely because we're no longer in a situation where there is this belief, especially on the part of the British government, that they owe anyone anything. In a sense, Anguilla is still linked, and for that reason, there is an obligation. But certainly when you heard Christina speak earlier, she made it clear that the British government's policy now, and has been for a long time, that any associated state that wants to disassociate and go towards independence has the United Kingdom's blessing, which is essentially a statement that the British government has repeated over and over again, that it's no longer in the business of holding colonies back, as they call them. And that to me is significant. He would have always had a challenge because his style was a style of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s even, where you were fighting an anti-colonial struggle. It's difficult to make demands in this environment. And you spoke about gender. One of the newer leaders in Anguilla is Josephine Gums, who I know quite well. And her style is different, as I said, being a woman, not only that, but certainly the style is different because it's hard to bang your hands on the table and make demands in the ways that he would have, because those days are gone. Britain was up until recently part of the European community. And certainly as you look at the shift in the way that the British overseas development arrangements work, they moved from Lomé to the Economic Partnership Agreement, but of course that doesn't relate to Anguilla. But the general tone is not one of, okay, we owe you something because of years of exploitation and we're going to give you something back. The amount of money that associated states get from the British government has also dwindled significantly to virtually anything, if there's anything at all, simply because there's a feeling that, everyone is now more or less on the same level. And that's the struggle that he would have had to fight, trying to make the point that Anguilla is not yet at the stage that Trinidad and Tobago or Jamaica is because of certain inbuilt developmental restrictions. And as a result, you have to look at it differently. But I agree with you that this anti-colonial struggle and fight in the forceful way that, Hughes and those guys used to really approach business, I don't really know that there's a place for that anymore. And often, as I said, it comes across as a critique, but the reality, and I don't know that his memorial is a place to engage that issue. But I think that leaders like that, or leaders who had that style, will find it increasingly difficult to make demands of a colonial power, simply because the days of colonial arrangements are essentially long since past.
Yeah, very interesting indeed, Peter. Dr. Clegg, again, we want you to just outline and set the stage for us in terms of the governance issues, leadership issues that someone like the late Hubert Hughes brought to the table. Dorothea mentioned that he was uncorrupted. You've never heard any trace, anything said about corruption. We hear oftentimes about many corrupt politicians in the Caribbean and other parts of the world, but never once have you heard that Hubert Hughes, that been aligned or been spoken about in that vein. Dr. Clegg.
Yes, I would imagine it was probably a source of frustration sometimes going against the British government and, of course, their own red lines. So certainly, again, we've talked about sort of the rhetoric sometimes used talking about blackmail and the yoke of oppression, which Mr. Hughes talked about when sometimes dealing with the British government. So I think that's probably a source of frustration. And in some respects, of course, there's pragmatism and pragmatism on both sides. But those red lines, when they sort of crunch against each other, can be quite difficult. And the British government's view, has been, as Peter says, long-standing one, where the red lines remain. Independence is an option, but actually the level of support perhaps provided by the British government to allow Anguilla to develop further to a point where it can move to a greater level of self-determination is not there. And for Anguilla, compared to, say, the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands or Bermuda, certainly, the level of economic wealth and development is certainly less. So that's an issue, I think, for Anguilla, and I'm sure Mr. Hughes found that as well, trying to advance the territory, trying to make progress, but the British government being quite rigid in its approach as it applied to all the territories. So that sort of lack of nuance and that lack of differentiation that the British government sometimes had towards the territories and still has towards the territories, I think was, as I said, a source of frustration. And maybe that's something for the future for both Anguilla and for the British government to look at, maybe as sort of in memory and a testament to what Mr. Hughes was trying to do, to look at the relationship going forward and how it can be improved, how it can be strengthened, and how it can be enhanced for the benefit of Anguilla.
Thank you, Dr. Clegg. Dorothea, Mr. Hughes was a proud and fierce champion of regional integration, and he didn't hold back on that at all. He was always very much into regional integration, bringing the Caribbean people together. Is this something he would have shared with you?
Yes, and it was very much because he was a politician of that era. And for us, this younger generation who didn't live through that post-colonial period and that struggle, that post-colonial period was not about, there was an internationalism about that post-colonial struggle in which there were no barriers. So the engagement, I don't know if some of you might have heard of the Manchester conference that took place in the UK, where leaders from around the world who were part of the old colonies got together to talk about how they shaped themselves afresh for the new century. So he was very, very much a politician in that mold of that time. But in terms of what he then strove to do was to use the power of the region in terms of garnering success for his island. He had, and this is why I think in terms of relations and diplomatic relations, he had an extraordinary relationship with other leaders in the fact that they would do things out of deep respect for him, his longevity in politics, he was uncorruptible, and he had a deep degree of integrity. So he was able to garner deals. I've talked a little bit about our work with the EU, but he did some extraordinary regional deals. We traveled together to Aruba to the Caribbean Regional Leaders Conference, which was sadly hasn't quite continued in the way it did in his time, but he was one of the main drivers of convincing people that they needed to work together. We needed to ensure that the next generation understood that this was a regional struggle. It wasn't just a struggle that you as an island on your own could do. So he was very passionate about those regional ideas, and it was him that drove many of the thoughts and the thinking and the ideas and the concepts that we developed in our UK and European office in terms of our engagement with the EU, that we drove a lot more regional programming in our time around sustainability, around the environment, and that was very much with his leadership. He would be the person that would negotiate those deals alongside us. He would be the person that would pull aside his colleagues from Aruba or from Bermuda and say, hey, we have an issue with our banks. Let's talk about a Caribbean solution. He was a driver on many of these issues because he had come from that generation of politicians who saw that the new struggle was about regional integration. Everybody else was doing it in the world. You know, the EU is the European Union. So he understood that. He understood that there is strength in numbers. And he drove that agenda with his colleagues. And there's a certain confidence that you have when you're a leader who understands that the reason for why he is there, and he's very clear about his reason, his rationale, and he's there for his people. There's a certain confidence that is behind you that means you have no fear in bringing your colleagues to the table, and you have no fear of working alongside your colleagues for the greater good for not only your people, but the wider region. So he was a fierce regionalist. He was a fierce internationalist. And he was always the person that would remind the UK about the international heritage in terms of the way the colonies had worked, in terms of the way the Commonwealth worked. And he was always passionate about working with partners wherever they were in the world. He was probably a little known fact was that he was a senior executive member of the UK International Society. He had networks all around the world and was an incredible, incredible internationalist.
Do you know if anything, Dorothea, that would tick him off? Something that would just get him really riled up and fired up when in that sort of a mood. Anything you could share with us along that line?
Well, I would say don't try and get one over on him with his people, because it's just not going to happen. So I remember right at the beginning of the our time in the UK, his time in government, I think people will know the Treasury was empty when he came in, and it was a pretty dire situation in 2010, a pretty dire situation in 2010. And at that point, the UK were very, very robust. They had just taken over TCI. There were many threats about taking over Anguilla. And I think that there were two things it was very clear to the UK on. Number one, do not try and put on his table anything to do with taking over Anguilla unless you've dealt with the issues of corruption that he had seen both in Anguilla and in the region. So when he, as a politician, is attempting to run Anguilla in the interests of his people in a way with a high level of integrity and transparency and accountability, do not then say that you are that you have criticisms about Anguilla and you'd like to take it over because Anguilla is not TCI. You could guarantee Mr. Hughes would put you in your place as a minister on that issue. And the other issue was corruption. He was a forthright person on corruption. And he would not tolerate, and quite rightly, any issues around a lack of transparency and accountability in his government. And he also refused very clearly with the UK to tackle any of the issues that they had failed to tackle in terms of good governance, because his view was the UK has responsibility for good governance and therefore it should enact it. And where it had failed, and he would use transshipment as an example, I know that many a time the UK tried to put the bill of transshipment that was owed to Italy on his table. And he would say very forcefully, I warned you about this, I told you about this, and I have always stood up against any sniff of a lack of accountability and transparency. It was not my watch, it was your watch. You deal with it. So those were the issues. Anguilla, and he truly was, do not come against his people because you won't come off well in that conversation. And I'm sure there's many a governor would tell you that story where you try and do anything over the people of Anguilla, you won't come off well. And on corruption, he was a fierce advocate for transparency and accountability and rooting out any shred of corruption. And I think he was, and I will say this on his behalf, he was extremely frustrated that he did not think the UK did enough on that issue. And he wanted the UK to take a stronger stance, and it never did.
And even in his advancing years, the fact that he was able to still comprehend and analyze very complex and difficult issues on the regional and international stage is truly phenomenal.
Oh yes, I mean, this is a man that in his 80s was negotiating incredibly technical elements of work with the EU, with the OECD, with the UK. He was managing the banking crisis. He was dealing with a whole range of very complex economic issues. But again, I say that the reason why he was able to do that and the passion that he brought to the table is that he woke up every morning and the people of Anguilla were the reason why he did what he did. So it didn't matter. And it's extraordinary now to think about it. It didn't matter that he was a man in his latter years because he was a man who had the mindset, the fast, quick mindset of someone in his midlife in terms of dealing with these issues. And he kept himself wholly up to date on many of these issues. So he was able to tackle the complexities that came across his table. Just extraordinary as a leader.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Dorothea. Peter Wickham, how would you line up the late Honorable Hubert Hughes, comparatively speaking, with some of those great leaders in our Caribbean region?
That's a difficult question to answer because, as I said, Anguilla's peculiar development places him in a subcategory of his own. So it's hard to compare him to any of the other regional giants. But I would say let's look at the individual's intellect for intellect. And I think that he lines up very nicely with the other regional greats, you know, like Burnham and Barrow and Williams and so on. They had nothing on him intellectually in terms of energy. I think what he had on them is the fact that he lived well into his 80s, which is significant because many of these leaders burnt out. Maybe that's a tribute to the Anguillan sunshine and Anguillan lifestyle that he had the energy to continue as long as he did. But in terms of his accomplishments, you know, it's challenging to make a comparison between what he could accomplish within the context of Anguilla and what someone like Eric Williams could have accomplished because of the size of the GDP of Trinidad and Tobago and finding oil. What he was able to accomplish in the context of Anguilla and in the context of what Anguilla would have been back in the 40s and 50s, and certainly what it is now. Because we have to remember that Anguilla's GDP per capita is comparable to some of the most developed countries in the world. And in a way, that has always been a problem for you guys, because persons look at that and say, but how can you be a country asking for developmental assistance when your GDP per capita is so high? So as a person who would have been one of the builders of a country that came from this agrarian base to where it is now, yeah, he lines up nicely and he did extremely well, exceedingly well. But I think it is unfair and unfortunate to make a comparison with Chief Minister Hughes to some of the other regional and international greats. But he definitely wants nothing, they have nothing on him as far as his energy, his intellect, his vision, developmental vision is concerned, and they all have a special place.
Yeah, thank you, Peter Wickham. Dr. Clegg, in all of this, and Peter alluded there to the accomplishments of the late Hubert Hughes, on a wider international level, and I know this is your area, what does this all say for the Caribbean region as a whole? And I want you to zoom in more so on the governance aspect of it and the developmental issues. And you may want to zoom in as well on those issues in the non-independent territories. And I know you specialize in this area, Dr. Clegg.
I think one issue is around democracy and the strength of democracy and the vibrancy of democracy within the Caribbean. Of course, over time, there have been some problems and some issues, but I think it's important to recognize the vibrancy of democracy within the territory and in other territories, and the place that Mr. Hughes had in that, and the fact that, you know, he in 2015, you know, moved away from frontline politics, which many leaders don't do. So I think he's in a long line of those who, you know, working effectively within the democratic system, as Dot has said already, trying to make the most of the sort of the more limited resources that the territory has. But it is that straitjacket, I guess, which is a challenge for many small states, but particularly probably for the non-self-governing territories within that context. And I know when Hurricane Irma hit, there were significant concerns and a lot of criticism of the fact that the UK government was restricting Anguilla and the other territories from gaining access to finance that was available to independent states, close neighbors such as Dominica and others. So in many ways, it takes a particular kind of leader in the territories to sort of navigate effectively the additional layer of complexity and sometimes the barriers to bring about effective change. So I think that's quite an interesting difference between the territories and the independent states, and the demands on the leaders to try and do that effectively, and also to get the balance right between defending the territory, defending the people of the territory, but also and holding those red lines, but also engaging effectively and making sure that the aims and the objectives you want from the British government in this case are attained. So I think there's that added complexity, which perhaps gives greater kudos to those long-standing leaders in the territories, that they've sustained, they've come back in many cases, and they've developed those strong and credible and in many ways respectful relationships with the metropolitan powers. So perhaps I would say that in relation to your question.
Yeah, and Dorothea, just following up on what Dr. Clegg said, the work of the late Hubert Hughes, laying that groundwork for persons like yourself in the UK who've been involved with the negotiations with the UK government, the groundwork that he has laid and the sort of level, the high level that he's demonstrated, and assisted persons like yourself in preparations for very serious talks with the British government about developmental issues and in terms of financing and for development projects on the island and so forth, and further down the road, eventually political independence.
Yes, and I would absolutely say that. I think a politician whose tenure was as long as his was, who had a very, very clear vision for his country, garnered a great deal of respect. You've seen today that we were joined by a former governor from Beijing to herself express her commemoration of this incredible man. He really, really defined what Anguilla was through his tenure. That he defined very much the culture and the context of the country to the UK. It was very clear, we are known as a mouse that roared from our revolution. I think the UK felt, certainly in my time, he made it very clear that he was going to be very strong on issues. And when the UK refused to hear his point of view, he took that to the media, and they were very clear that he would appear on the front page of the Financial Times or the BBC, and he would make his views very, very clearly known. And the hurricane, again, I would say we walk in his stream, that the views that were put on the table by people like myself and other members of the Caribbean and the Anguillan and Caribbean community, when we saw the weakness of the UK's response to the Caribbean at that time, were very, very much in that stream of, we cannot ever abandon our people to at all, at any stage. As politicians, we always have a duty to serve and lead and serve again. And that's why I say, when I started this conversation, I said he was a veranda politician, that his starting point was the people of Anguilla. That's where he started. And that meant that for all of us, this next generation, and I have to say, we now have an extraordinary young team of politicians, of younger politicians in Anguilla. And you can see very much some of that thinking coming through, which is, we start with the people first. This is about people and country first. And there's a great deal of respect for him. The UK may not have always agreed with him, but they certainly respected his views. And that is, from an Anguillan perspective, we have been blessed to have someone of that magnitude represent us, represent our views, represent the island. And it certainly has left us in a better place as an island, better suited to tackle the challenges of the 21st century.
Thank you so very much. And I see we've been joined by former Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, Dr. Denzil Douglas. I see he's just joined us here, and he should be with us momentarily. He did indicate earlier that he had a funeral of a close family member to attend to this morning in St. Kitts under the state of emergency there, courtesy of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I see that he's just joined us. So we should be hearing from Dr. Douglas in just a bit. Peter Wickham, I want to go back to you as someone who's been keeping an eye across Caribbean issues very closely. And for many years, Hubert Hughes spoke quite a bit and expressed quite fiercely the need for improvement to the Anguilla Constitution, for example, and other changes, legislative changes within his island. And I would just like to hear your thoughts, Peter, on these type of issues that would have been raised by the former leader, no doubt with the British officials.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting struggle because there's a struggle between control and resources. And I think that the British formula is fairly clear. You can have as much control as you like, but it would often mean less resources. His challenge is to negotiate a space where you can have greater control of your own destiny within the context of what is possible. Or alternatively, you will have less access to resources. And I guess for him, the challenge is you're trying to negotiate greater control for yourself while holding on to the resources and access to the resources that you have. While the parent government, the British government is saying, well, look, you know, you're willing to have control, you can have independence if you want. But ultimately, the further you move away from us, the less access to resources you will have. And that really is the conundrum that persons like Chief Minister Hughes will find himself in as you attempt to negotiate. I'm not sure what the solution is. It's a difficult one to manage, but we have several examples of, you know, post-colonial territories, of territories that are still associated states. And, you know, I'm anxious to hear from Dr. Douglas in terms of his own perspective. St. Kitts and Nevis would have been one that moved towards independence. The challenge is that you do that at a time when you understand that the more independent you become, the more control you gain, the less access to resources that you have. And that would have been his negotiation.
And so that is a very good cue for me to introduce and say a very warm welcome to the former Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, the Right Honorable Dr. Denzil Douglas. A very good morning to you, Dr. Douglas. Welcome.
Good morning to you, and thank you for having me as part of this very important dialogue that we're having. How can I assist now?
Yes, firstly, we would like to hear your thoughts, your reflection on the recent passing of the late Honorable Chief Minister of Anguilla, Hubert Hughes, someone I know you knew very well. We would just like to hear your opening to this, and then we can proceed.
Right. I consider Chief Minister Hughes as one who has made tremendous contribution in the political and social and economic development of the lives of the people of Anguilla. And not only the people of Anguilla, but of course, the people of the Eastern Caribbean states. In fact, later this week, we will be celebrating the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Boston, which brought into being the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States, and thus formalized 40 years ago the thrust towards greater collaboration and a determination, of course, to move forward as a group of nations together. It is in this context, really, that I would have met Chief Minister Hughes. Of course, although he would have been one of the youngest Anguillians to have contested elections in the days of Sir Robert Llewellyn Bradshaw. In fact, as we are aware, back in 1961, when he was just 28 years old, he contested the last general election that was held for the colonial state of St. Kitts Nevis and Anguilla. And at that time, he was contesting among four others. He was contesting for the lone seat that Anguilla would have provided in that legislature at that time. And then long after, when back in 1994, he became the chief minister for the first time. I myself came into office in 1995. And so for that span, 1995 to 2000, it was a period when I would have worked with him very, very closely and understood exactly what he wanted for not only Anguillians, but for the people of the Eastern Caribbean. People would say that he was exceptionally harsh in his criticisms of the British. And I don't think it was that there was any unnecessary problem that he would have had. Nothing at all personal, but he felt very strongly that there might have been a stepping back of Anguilla from advancing towards what then we considered to be political independence, when Anguilla back in 1967 and was formalized back in 1981, I think, after Anguilla became a colony of Great Britain yet again. These are the times which to some extent would have created the political thinking of Chief Minister Hughes. Because as we sat on several occasions in heads of governments meeting, both at the OECS level and the CARICOM level, he was always very, very interested in pointing out the peculiar situation that Anguilla had found itself, though embraced by the states within the subregion and the states within the wider Caribbean or CARICOM entity. So it is almost as if there was an aspiration to go forward, hoping maybe that it would have been possible with Anguilla as an independent state. But of course, circumstances, situation on the ground, economically and maybe politically, did not allow Anguilla to advance, especially at a time when it could have advanced, but never seized that opportunity within the changing events that we had seen in the economy in Anguilla, and eventually, of course, the political advancement that it would have liked to make. Chief Minister was very, very much concerned about the development of the people of Anguilla. Even though he was, of course, one of the members who supported integration, deeply so, he still, of course, put foremost and frontal the development opportunities and advancement for the people of Anguilla. And we always look forward to have had his views on how he saw things. Because apart from Montserrat and the BVI, Anguilla was one of the central territories within the OECS and within the wider Caribbean community as well. I think I'll stop here for now and let maybe the specific questions be asked.
Yes, certainly. It's certainly good to have you, and we are happy that you were able to make it in. As it relates to Mr. Hughes's participation and attending these meetings, OECS and COM, What was he like as a colleague leader, speaking on all the regional issues and his contribution, the contribution that he would have made to OECS and CARICOM issues?
Well, there was no question about how much he felt at home within the sub-regional community and the greater regional community. He felt that despite what would have happened to Anguilla and the relationship with St. Kitts and Nevis back in the late 60s and went on into 1980, he felt nevertheless he was, and Anguilla was part of that community. And he participated fully as much as he would have been allowed from the constitution of Anguillians. He felt very strongly, and on many occasions, he would say, well, you know, I support what you are doing, but of course, I have to have the support as well from the government, that is the governor in particular of Anguilla, to ensure that whatever important steps will be made towards further integration and advancement of the life of the people of the Eastern Caribbean and of the wider Caribbean community. Although he would have been an observer most of the time, he was not able to pursue beyond a certain constitutional limit because of the status that Anguilla held. But he always felt that he was part and parcel of what was happening as the Caribbean advanced as it has over the years.
I want you, Dr. Douglas, to share with us Mr. Hughes' own association, close association that is, with the St. Kitts Nevis Labour Party.
Right. He always reminded me that he was a member of the Labour Party. Always reminded me of that. He spoke very colorfully of Mr. Bradshaw, Sir Robert Llewellyn Bradshaw. He spoke of what he saw in terms of the political development as a young man, because you know he would have gone to the grammar school in St. Kitts in those days and almost felt at home. He was able to go into every and all of the communities, the villages and towns here in St. Kitts and felt very, very much at home. And so I think that closeness, that bonding that he had with the people of St. Kitts and Nevis would have come from his earliest days as a student in the grammar school here. And then, as I said, as an advocate of the St. Kitts Nevis Labour Party in Anguilla at age 28 years. He was one of 4 candidates. He running for the St. Kitts Nevis Labour Party when the general elections back in 1961 were contested. And of course, you would have seen that it is just after that election and the election then of 1966, which then would have advanced us in a particular semi-independent status with Great Britain. That's when a lot of the problems in Anguilla would have erupted. And it is very, very interesting to see that he continued a very strong relationship with the Labour Party, so much so that when he won the elections back in 1994, I did call him to congratulate him. And he did say, it's only a matter of time that you will join me. And so in 1995, I was able then to win the elections and we became colleague heads of government within our entity.
So you would say, Dr. Douglas, that the late Hubert Hughes had much of his political grounding within the St. Kitts Labour Party, where he would have learned and would have assimilated a lot of the politics from Mr. Bradshaw and others at that time.
Yes. In fact, although, of course, Anguilla is a relatively smaller territory than St. Kitts, I think the fervor that drove him politically was the same fervor that drove so many of the leaders of the Labour Party in St. Kitts and Nevis at that time. You would remember how difficult it was for, at that time, the leader, Sir Robert Llewellyn-Bradshaw, to relinquish the constitutional relationship, the bonding between St. Kitts and Nevis and Anguilla. And I think to a large extent, it came from what they observed to have been at that time almost a stepping back, a turning back of the hand of time by allowing one of the three territories of the state of St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla to revert to British colonial status. One would have said that he was anti-British. I don't think so. He was more the true statesman that represented what the Labour Party of the times represented, that this was an opportunity to advance for the people social, economic, and political justice. And that is what I think was the main thrust of the political philosophy of Chief Minister Hughes. Economic, social, and political justice, and felt to a large extent as was being preached by the Labour Party in St. Kitts and Nevis and Anguilla at that time. I think he imbibed that, and that was the driving force, the fervor around which he went forward as a political leader then, and eventually becoming the Chief Minister of Anguilla.
On a more personal note, any personal memories of the late Hubert Hughes? You've been with him over these many years, during his time in politics and in government as well as head of government.
Hubert Hughes was a walking political historian. There would be many, many occasions when generally our meetings would have had the benefit of his historical wisdom. And he could speak for hours on end, bringing the political history that shaped the development of the people of the OECS, if not the people of the wider Caribbean region. Personally, I was impressed with his very many in-depth contributions without referencing to any notes whatsoever, any written notes whatsoever. And so relied on his experience as a leading political figure in Anguilla and in the Caribbean region. In his more sociable style and life, he was commonly seen in African outfits. He loved to wear the African fabric and garments. And on many occasions, he took pride, especially during periods of relaxation. He would be adorned in beautiful African shirt or African gown. He felt very much close to Mother Africa, where naturally his ancestors would have come from. He also was exceptionally helpful. I know of persons who would have had their grandfathers migrating from Anguilla to St. Kitts and living there for years. And he would be very helpful in pointing out and assisting people to get their British or Anguillan citizenship first, and British citizenship if it became necessary after, and European citizenship as well. Thus giving again people, helping them to make use of the opportunities that being citizen of another European territory or of England or Britain, UK, would advance not necessarily that person, but their children after they would have acquired that citizenship as well. He was helpful in a way that you would not necessarily find very, very many national political leaders. He looked after those small, what you call small matters of helping people in advancing when he did not necessarily have to do so.
So, Dr. Douglas, how would you describe Mr. Hughes's legacy?
Mr. Hughes, over the last 40 years, especially in celebration of the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States, must be seen as a major player in not only the founding, but the advancing of that achievement. Chief Minister Hughes would have dotted the landscape of the politics of Anguilla in a significant way. He would have been the longest serving politician of Anguilla up to the point when he would have passed away. His passion for the socioeconomic and political development for the people of Anguilla is unsurpassed. And I therefore believe that the people of Anguilla should remember him for his deep and abiding faith in democracy and the democratic advancement of the people of Anguilla, always contesting elections. In fact, I think he would have contested all of the elections from 1964, I believe, until 2020, until 2015, I would say, when he would have retired, because he didn't contest after that. Hughes, therefore, is a giant that strode the political landscape of the Eastern Caribbean and of the wider Caribbean community.
And lastly, from you, Dr. Douglas, I'm sure you'd want to extend your own personal condolences directly to Mr. Hughes's wife and the rest of the family and the wider Anguillan community.
Of course, I use this opportunity again to extend my own personal behalf on behalf of the St. Kitts Nevis Labour Party and the members from the opposition benches in Parliament here, our profound condolences to his dear wife and his sons and other family members. Chief Minister Hughes, I am certain, would have left a void in his departure. But the people of Anguilla, I am certain, who have been impacted so significantly by his life and times, would remember his dear family in their prayers. And we too here in the former sister island of St. Kitts and Nevis would want to say to the people of Anguilla, you should be proud of the life and times of Chief Minister Hubert Hughes, because he would have made life for the people of Anguilla better over the years. Thank you.
We want to thank you so very much, Dr. Denzel Douglas, for taking time out to share today on this special program as we pay tribute to the late Honorable Chief Minister of Anguilla, Hubert Benjamin Hughes. Thank you so very much, Dr. Douglas.
Thank you. Thank you.
And so I will go to Dorothea Hodge to just get her very brief closing thoughts. Dorothea? Okay, it doesn't seem as though Dorothea is still with us. I think she must have left us. So Dr. Douglas, again, we want to thank you for coming up and here today. All the best to you and the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, I think we have Dorothea back. Dorothea, your closing thoughts.
And Keith, just to say thank you for hosting today. Just to also say again, we are here today to honor a great, extraordinary, amazing man. And we give thanks for his life well lived. And we send our love and our best wishes and our regards and our prayers to his family. And I pray that tomorrow will be a real commemoration of the life well lived. And we will all walk in his stream and remember his words as we traverse forward in our vision for a new Anguilla that he carried in his heart. May we carry those in our hearts as well. God bless you and God bless the family.
Thank you very much, Dorothea Hodge, head of the Anguilla office in the UK. And just before we wrap it up, I wish to share with you some information I got from Delsic Ray, a former politician who now in the United States. Delsic did in fact send me a little note, and I would like to share it with the people, where he describes the late Hubert Hughes as a lone ranger, as he often used to refer to himself, or the champion of the people. In fact, Delsic is saying that Mr. Hughes' funeral on June the 18th is also his birthday, the anniversary of his birth. Quoting here from the note from Delsic Ray, he says, Hubert was family. To underscore that statement, the whole block of Hughes comes from my mother's side, as her grandmother was a Hughes from South Hill. In that same year of the late leader Hubert and my dad were school and classmates. I can remember when I had offered myself to be part of the Anguilla political landscape, the Honorable Hubert Benjamin Hughes had reached out to my dad and asked him to tell me that he needed to come to see him. The late Hubert Benjamin Hughes made it clear to me that while it was a noble thing to do, he applauded me. He made it abundantly clear that I was with the wrong party. Also that he and the leader of the AEF, which I was a member of, did not see eye to eye. Continuing here from this note from Delsic Ray, he gave me his view of the issues and reiterated that his party and leadership was best suited to handle the issues in Anguilla and champion the causes of and for the Anguilla people. The Honorable Hubert Benjamin Hughes shared several jokes from his school days about him and my dad during our chat. I can attest that he always kept me laughing whenever he interacted after that. When I heard he was sick, I always inquired through my dad. His wife, who was my early childhood teacher, Norma, used to get regular phone calls from Dad and his wife, Yvonne. Continuing here, quoting from this note from Delsic Ray, when I learned about the news of his passing, I made contact with Hayden. I gave him my heartfelt sympathy and asked him to pass on my condolences and love to his mom, his brother, Greg, and the rest of the family. Honorable Hubert Benjamin Hughes had his own style, love it or not. That is what I will always remember most about him. May Honorable Hubert Benjamin Hughes rest in peace. May his memories be a blessing to his family and all the good people that he has ever came in contact with. Again, this is a note that I got from Delsic Way, former politician now residing in the United States. And so, folks, here's where we will be wrapping up on roundtable number 2, reflection. The late Honorable Chief Minister Hubert Benjamin Hughes, the man on his politics. We'd like to certainly thank very much the former governor of Anguilla, now the deputy head of mission, UK Embassy in Beijing, China, Christina Scott, Peter Wickham, a political scientist out of Barbados, Dr. Peter Clegg from the University of the West of England in the UK, Bristol, Dorothea Hodge, the head of the UK office in the UK, Dr. Denzel Douglas, the former Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis. And at the start of the broadcast, we heard from Will Johnson, former politician and civil servant, and a very good friend of the late Hubert Hughes on the island of Saba. We want to thank Clean Stream and Radio Anguilla for facilitating this production. Thanks to all our viewers and listeners. I am Keith Stonegrave saying goodbye and so long.